What's up guys, I'm going to be updating my top 5 videos for each role now alongside my new tier list which will be out later this week for patch 4.3. Now first up we'll be looking at the AD carries, and this list is going to be on who is the strongest and who stands the biggest chance of winning a solo queue game. I'm going to try and do these videos a bit differently as well, so I'll give you an overview of the champion, some builds to try out, and then how to win with them, but also how to beat them when you're against them. So at number 5 we have Draven. Now Draven is a monster in solo queue. He has a really high damage and snowball potential with his passive, so if you get ahead you're likely going to stay ahead. The problem with Draven is that people are starting to realise how strong he is, and he's really weak when he's behind, so you're probably going to get camped, and with no escape it's really hard to get away. The other big thing is that Draven has a huge skill cap, and it's kind of a good thing and a bad thing at the same time. Catching axes is difficult because in a team fight you already have a ton of things to think about, and so you're trying to watch your positioning while controlling where the axes go, and it can kind of lead to a mess. The good side is that the more time you put into learning him, the better you're going to be and the harder you will carry. The bad side is that if you drop those axes, you're probably going to be useless and lose the game. Draven is a risky pick for AD right now with the popular junglers, but it's high risk, high reward. So there are other builds right now floating around, but I think this is the build that you want to go 99% of the time. AD is really good on Draven because it scales with his Q, and Bloodthirster at Last Whisper is all you really need to start hurting. Now when you're playing as Draven, the biggest thing to focus on is always having 2 axes spinning. Not only will this let you stack your passive for some cash, but it also means that if you do fight and you drop an axe, then you'll have the cooldown to immediately start spinning another. A lot of Draven players I see will only spin 1 axe and then they'll activate the second when they start to fight. Now if you don't drop an axe in the fight, then sure, this actually works, but if you do drop one, then you can't start spinning another, and that's the problem. Now leading on from this is really that Draven has 2 major playstyles. Now if you're comfortable on him and you know his damage, then you can try and get kills and go aggressive, but you can also just farm and wait to cash in on your passive stacks mid game. Now this change made Draven a lot less risky to pick because he doesn't really have to win his lane, but there is still the problem of him getting camped the crap out of. Now the 2 biggest ways to beat Draven are to zone him from the wave and not let him keep his axes spinning, or to just kill him and get rid of his passive stacks. Now the theory behind these 2 isn't actually that difficult, it's just being able to zone him or kill him that's the problem. Now number 4 we have Caitlyn, and remember that this list is based on their overall ability to win or chance at winning solo queue. Now Caitlyn is really good at controlling her lane, and you'll often end up just zoning, pushing into tower and then getting a huge CS lead. Her range makes using minion based trading very easy, and she also doesn't really have to rely on her team to protect her in team fights, which is ideal in solo queue. Now the problems arise with her mid game damage if she doesn't get snowballed hard enough. Chances are that even if you win your lane, the opposing AD will outdamage you in all out fights mid game because you only have 1 damaging ability and you have to rely on your auto attacks. Now relying on auto attacks means that you scale very hard with items, but you actually have to get those items first to be effective, so she's strong early, weak-ish mid game, and then strong again late game. Now there are 2 builds here that kind of alter her playstyle a little. So the left hand side is the more common route right now because it buffs her early game damage with a ton of AD and lifesteal. The extra AD means that you want to be using your Q whenever it's off cooldown, and your ult is actually much more effective too. The Infinity Edge route is more auto attack damage, but is way more reliant on items. Now basically, to explain this, once you reach 3 items, then the build on the right would probably be stronger and outdamage the single target DPS, but it's going to take you longer to get there, and that will kind of extend the mid game low in damage that Caitlyn already has. To win with Caitlyn, you need to focus on dominating your lane early by constantly poking with auto attacks and your Q. One of the things that makes playing against Cait so hard is that it's difficult to get on top of her, as she'll just net away and Q you as soon as you step in front of minions. Now as I mentioned earlier, she doesn't really have as much upfront damage as other ADs, so in most cases you want to full engage onto her and then fight her before she has a chance to poke you down. Her Q is also a lot of her early damage, so if you're confident that you personally have the damage to kill her, then don't be afraid to flash to dodge her Q. That will give you a huge lead and probably turn the trade in your favour. At number 3 we have Lucian, but these top 3 are all on a very similar level. Now Lucian has a crap ton of damage and is really strong in lane. People underestimate his ultimate, but seriously you can unload that thing on someone's face and it will get you control of the lane really easily. He has a good range to poke if he lines his Q up on minions, he has an escape and is really good at turning fights because as someone is chasing you, you'll just ult and then turn when it runs out. The other reason I especially like Lucian in solo queue is because he doesn't really need any protection, much like Caitlyn. Now if someone jumps onto you, then you'll just W and ult the diver and it will speed you up as you're damaging them. He doesn't really scale as hard as others because he majorly relies on his abilities for damage, and he'll also run out of mana in lane a lot if you're constantly fighting. The biggest thing that I tell people who want to improve with Lucian is to realise that if you hit every single bullet of that ultimate, then you'll do a ton of damage, and using that properly is a big key to dominating your lane. Now there are a ton of build paths right now and it's impossible to put all of them in this kind of video, but I've given you 2 of the different kinds that there really are. Now the build on the left focuses more on ability and ult damage early, and it will give you a lot more burst damage. You can also replace Shiv here with a Triforce, but Triforce is a lot of money and so you can only really do it if you're ahead. Now on the other side of this is more about your passive. Now Sheen is really good because you have a lot of ways to proc it with your abilities, and then you want to always attack after for your passive anyway, which is going to apply the Sheen. Now this is less about burst and more about single target damage, so it's kind of up to you which route you want to go. Now the biggest thing to practice when playing Lucian is lining up your Q on a minion and having it hit the enemy behind them. Your Q has a huge range after the initial target, and so if you hit the enemy while putting yourself in no danger, it's going to be perfect. The other big thing is to use your passive properly. Now as an example, one of the most common kill combos is going to be dashing forward, auto-attacking for the passive, using your Q and then auto-attacking again. This will do about 60% of the enemy AD's health and is always a great way to finish people off. It's kind of always natural to want to use your abilities at the start of a fight, but seriously your passive is so important that you need to space it out. Playing against Lucian is pretty hard in lane because he does have a lot of damage, but there are always things you can do. Now I actually love picking Vayne into Lucian because she can tumble out of his Q and ult, and that is a huge amount of damage of Lucian's kit that is suddenly missed. It's the same idea with other ADs, so if you're fighting early, don't be afraid to flash his Q because you'll get a huge advantage doing it. Now I said before that he has mana problems, so the easiest way to get him to run out of mana is to push the wave and force him to push it back with his Q. It means that he has to use mana to farm, so he can't really use the mana to fight you. So at number 2 we have Sivir, and while her damage is less than Lucian, her ultimate is broken and it can change games by itself. So there are tons of things that you can do with it, but most commonly you can ult your jungler in, you can ult away from their jungler, you can catch people mid-game, or you can even run away from people mid-game. Basically, it allows you to choose when you want to fight, so you should never be fighting at a disadvantage when you have Sivir on your team. Now with that and her spell shield, she's probably the safest AD to play in lane and in team fights because it's like a built-in Banshees and it's so hard to play around. Now apart from being safe, she actually does a ton of damage, especially to the carries at an AoE, but she does kind of struggle against tanks. Now there obviously has to be a trade-off for being so good mid to late game, and so she is kind of weak in lane before she gets her first couple of items. I've put 2 builds up here for the sake of variety, but honestly I only ever use the build on the left hand side. Sivir's Q and W are most of her damage, and both scale really hard with AD, which means that if you stack AD and arm penetration, then your spells would be doing way more damage. The build on the right is more for auto attacking, and so is good for shredding tanks, but your abilities will be doing a ton of less damage. Now as you probably guessed, the key to winning with Sivir is using her ultimate properly. People will follow you if you use it at the right time. Now what I mean by this, like for example, if you're standing mid lane and so are the enemy team, but you suddenly see one of their members bot, then if you ping and ult, most people are going to understand what that means and will charge after the enemy team with you. Now doing damage as Sivir is pretty easy because you just throw your Q and W out and then auto attack, but she has such a short range on that auto attack that you need to be very careful about avoiding crowd control. Now if you mess your spell shield up and get caught, then you are pretty much screwed, especially considering you normally use your ult to start a fight, not have it there in case you get caught. Now in lane, her range is a problem for her, and that's one of the best ways to punish her. When her spells are on cooldown, you can go aggressive and she literally has nothing to fight back at you with. The biggest thing to realise when playing against Sivir is that if she ults you, there is no way you can run away. So you have to be in a situation where you can fight her, and the best way of doing this is to keep her health low enough so she doesn't want to run at you. So at number 1, and this is not going to be a surprise, it's Jinx. Now I said these three are all close, and Lucian and Sivir both do certain things better than Jinx does, but overall Jinx is just way more of a carry right now. Now first off is her Q, so either she can deal a ton of damage with the attack speed minigun, or if she's struggling she can farm at range with her rocket. Now this just means that it's really hard to shut her down, because even though the rocket costs mana, she can just buy a few mana potions and will easily be able to earn back the money that it cost. Now she also has a lot of kill potential in lane after level 6, but she also snowballs really hard and has a crazy late game because of that AoE and attack speed on her Q. The thing with Jinx right now is that she can do everything, and she can do everything really well. The only weakness that she has is that she has no escape, so she's not that difficult to gank or shut down if you pick a very aggressive lane to go against her. Now because she's so flexible, you can either go for a more single target damage or a kind of AoE build. Now the build on the left will make your W and ult do a lot of damage, but it's also going to give you a ton of lifesteal, which makes you great at dueling people up close with a minigun. Now the build on the right is still good single target damage, but the biggest thing here is that your rockets can AoE crit, and that is why Infinity Edge is so good when team fighting as Jinx. Now both are good. The Infinity Edge is better if you're ahead because you don't need the lifesteal as much, but the Bloodthirster route is the one that I normally take as it's much more safe. Now in lane you can either have a lot of control or get completely bent over, and it's basically up to your playstyle. Now if you poke with your rocket and hit a few zaps your W, then you will slowly get control of the lane, and that's the ideal situation for you because you can just free farm. Now Jinx isn't really that hard to play in lane, but she's more about decision making, as it's important to know when to ult because it's an execute, when to be in your minigun, and when to just have more range and be safer instead. Now I kind of touched on it earlier, but her biggest weakness and the easiest way to beat her is to take a ton of crowd control across your team because she has no way to avoid it unless she has flash. In lane you ideally want to get your jungler to camp as much as possible and always try and start the fight. Now Jinx finds it hard to run away and do damage at the same time, but if you let her engage then she has a lot of different ways to follow up safely. Basically, if you take the fight to them, then you're much more likely to win than if you sit back and let them pick the fight. So instead of doing an honourable mentions part, I'm going to say who I think is going to be the next AD making a big impact in League. Now this time round it's going to be Corki. Now he has a ton of damage right now, and with the new change to his Q, it means that you can actually rush a Bloodthirster, which fixes his low range and makes it so hard to lane against him. Now if his Q didn't look like a Pokemon ability and feel so horrible when you use it, you'd probably see him a lot more, but honestly he is still actually pretty strong. So that wraps up my top 5 ADs for patch 4.3, and if you enjoyed the video please like and subscribe, and also let me know down below if you think someone else should be here and why. Now that being said, I will catch you in my next video.